The game Palworld, released by Pocket Pair, has exceeded everyone's expectations and has taken the world by storm, selling over 25 million copies so far, which is just currently beating out Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. However, many people are discussing the similarities between Palworld and Pokemon designs, and are wondering if any sort of legal action could one day occur. So let's dive into this topic together. But before we begin, let's make a few clarifications. First up, a lot of people are specifically mentioning Nintendo taking action, but who actually owns Pokemon? Pokemon is owned by the Pokemon Company, and then from there they have three parent companies, Nintendo, Game Freak, and Creatures Incorporated, formerly known as Ape. So to avoid confusion as to who owns what in what circumstances, I'm just going to refer to them as a single unit for simplicity's sake. Second, I am not a legal professional, so nothing in this video should serve as a substitute for any legal advice or legal education. Third, I'm going to be using translation tools for various Japanese articles and documents, which may not be 100% accurate. And lastly, a very special thank you to Dennis Karhala and Keiji Sugiyama, because their extensive research over the years made my life so much easier here. And now let's cut right to the chase about fair use. There are a lot of questions about if these PALs are distinctly transformed enough to have new meaning, if they're protected under parity, and a bunch of other questions which are completely irrelevant, because both sets of intellectual property are owned by Japanese companies, meaning that the jurisdiction is more likely to be in Japan, where the fair use provisions that many of you are familiar with don't even exist. While the USA's common law system relies heavily upon case law to serve as precedents, Japan's civil law system is based upon codified statutes, so it's much more direct about what you can and cannot do. But don't let that trip you up too much. The overall fundamental goals of protecting original creations are still the same, just achieved differently. And while Japan's copyright laws are generally more strict than the USA's, quite a few of the permissions and exceptions granted are still going to be somewhat familiar to you, just more narrow in scope. And while Japanese cases don't serve as precedents in the way that they do in the USA, they still provide us some useful insights to how certain situations can be interpreted. And we even have quite a few similar cases that have occurred over the years. In the United States, we have Vice Publications Incorporated versus Rural Telephone Service Company, where a phone book company copied the directories of another phone book company, and then they were caught due to fake listings laid out as a trap. But it was ultimately determined in the Supreme Court that information lacking any creative human input cannot be copyrighted. And then coincidentally, Japan also has a case involving a phone book directory, where a Japanese man's compilation was deemed not to be creative enough to be eligible for copyright protection. And another important detail is that it was noted that because such an idea had already been done before, that limited the protectability of it. So that's the floor, but what about the ceiling? How similar is too similar in gaming? It depends. In the US, there's enough cases on clone games to make an entirely separate video on, but we'll keep it short for now. In Atari vs. Philips, a Pac-Man clone called KC Munchkin was ultimately blocked because although the gameplay and maze chase concept itself was deemed to not be a protectable expression, the combination of the Gobbler, Ghosts, and role reversal mechanics were. But then around the same time, Atari actually lost a case against Amusement World over the similarities between asteroids and meteors. Even though Amusement World openly played asteroids and then stated that they took the idea of asteroids to create meteors, copyright laws don't expressly prohibit this. A commonly recurring theme in this video is going to be that you can't copyright an idea, but only your specific stylized expression of that idea, because the point is to protect your original creations, but not outright create a monopoly on anything and everything even remotely similar. Which also means that another theme is going to be that just because something is copyrighted doesn't mean that every single element of it is a protected expression. More recently, you may have heard what's been dubbed as the squint test from Tetris Holding LLC versus Zeo Interactive Incorporated. But there are some really important footnotes here that tend to be overlooked. The gameplay for Tetris itself was not deemed to be a protected expression, but only the 7 specific shapes used in Tetris. And more importantly, the founder of Zeo was found to have previously applied for a license, and then upon rejection, directly copied from the Tetris app to make their own clone Mino. When establishing the legal standard of substantially similar in copyright infringement cases, after you establish that you actually own the copyright and what elements are protected, you generally have to show that the defendant actually copied the work and then did so to the point of misappropriation. And then in this Tetris clone case, copying was proven, which weighed into the decision. But in the US, 2 of the most important video game clone cases both come from Data East, the first time as the plaintiff and the second time as the defendant. In 1988, Data East sued Epix, alleging that the game World Karate Championship infringed upon their own game Karate Champ. Initially, it was found to be copyright infringement, but this ruling was eventually overturned on appeal and found to not be infringement, because like with the asteroids case, no actual direct copying ever occurred. Additionally, you can't actually copyright the idea of karate, a karate game, the design elements associated with karate, or the common attacks associated with karate. Then in 1994, Data East was sued by Capcom, where they alleged that Data East game Fighter's history infringed upon their classic game Street Fighter II. And while yes, they were absolutely imitating Street Fighter II's success, and they even had their own Chun-Li knockoff, nothing was directly copied. And nearly every design element and attack was considered too generic to be a protectable expression. And both of these cases featured two important concepts at play. The first one is that within the realm of the idea-expression distinction, you have something known as the merger doctrine, which when specifically applied to copyright law, goes over how some ideas are only expressible in one or a very limited number of ways. So because the idea and the expression of that idea merge so much, it's not actually a protectable expression because it would inadvertently create a monopoly on that idea. The second concept is pretty similar, being scène à faire, which is French for scene to be made, scene that must be done, or an obligatory scene. Established in Kane vs. Universal Pictures in 1942, this means that certain elements can't be protected when they are customary to a genre. And then in Japanese law, a lot of the same principles apply. You can't copyright an idea alone, the courts don't want to rule in a manner that creates a monopoly, the gold standard is still to prove direct copying, and the merger doctrine for copyright exists in Japan as well. As far as gaming cases go, I know of one, special thanks to Serene's Forest. Shozo Kage helped develop the first 5 Fire Emblem games. After the release of Thracia 776 on the Super Nintendo, he ultimately decided that instead of developing a new game for the Nintendo 64, he formed his own studio named Tirnanog and partnered with Enabrain to develop a game for the PlayStation 1. Originally, the game in demo was titled Emblem Saga. And not only was Emblem Saga near verbatim to what you would expect to see in a Fire Emblem game in terms of gameplay mechanics, art, character designs, and more, but Kage even stated that the game would take place in the universe of the first Fire Emblem game, and alluded to existing characters from Fire Emblem that would be in Emblem Saga. Various outlets even reported on it as a Fire Emblem game for the PlayStation. But the game was delayed, the title was changed to Tearing Saga, and several very small changes were made, such as character redesigns and removing direct references to copyrighted material owned by Nintendo. But shortly after the game's release, Nintendo still sued. But ultimately, upon reaching the Tokyo Supreme Court, they upheld the decision that it was not copyright infringement because all of the references to Fire Emblem had been removed. However, Mr. Kage was still found to have violated Japan's fair competition laws due to acts of confusion from placing the game in the Fire Emblem universe initially, which resulted in a fine, but the game was still allowed to be sold, and Mr. Kage was allowed to develop several future games similar to Fire Emblem. But remember, Japanese cases aren't precedents in the way they are in the US, and this was a very condensed summary for a very multifaceted case. But in both countries, these cases explain why various spiritual successors or similar games are allowed to exist in the first place. Alright, so now let's finally start talking about Pokemon, shall we? Starting with the gameplay mechanics before the designs themselves. Pokemon, or pocket monsters, when extremely oversimplified, is about collecting creatures by capturing them in balls, recording their information in a Pokédex, and battling with them in order to help you obtain a stronger team to help you on your journey. And while Palworld plays more like Ark with pals instead of dinosaurs, it still has some small mechanical overlap with Pokemon, collecting creatures in balls, recording their information in the PAL deck, battling with them, breeding them, and so forth. Independently, not only are most of these ideas not copyrightable and would fall under merger doctrine, but they existed before Pokemon anyways. Monster breeding existed in Dragon Quest monsters before it was introduced in Pokemon Gold and Silver. The Pokédex or Pokemon Index is pretty much like any other monster compendium, bestiary, or encyclopedia, which are all incredibly common in RPGs, and even monster taming games as a whole predates Pokemon, with the first game in the Shin Megami Tensei franchise being released in 1987, nearly an entire decade before Pokemon, and even predating some of the earliest available concept art. And while Pokemon did shift the focus from recruiting to capturing them in balls, when looking at the earliest concept art back when Pocket Monsters was still called Capsule Monsters, it was inspired by Gashapon, which made its way into Japan back in the 1960s. And the show Ultraman even featured capsule kaijus. So no, you don't have to constantly change what shape you capture a creature in with each different monster collecting game. You just can't specifically create the Pokeball or Palsphere. So if the Pokemon game framework as a whole was a protectable expression, we would have likely had a few lawsuits throughout the late 90s and early 2000s because of the sheer number of monster collecting games that came out during that time, combined with the limited hardware available to express those ideas. And then moving ahead of Pokemon's initial release, you now have games such as Nexomon, Monster Crown, Koromon, Cassette Beast, and many more, all of which were very much designed to encapsulate the Pokemon experience to a much closer level than Palworld. Many of the same design tropes and similar mechanics made it into these games. And not only have the rights holders of Pokemon never taken any action against these studios, but you can actually play a bunch of them on the Nintendo Switch, so they really don't care about them games nearly as much as people think until there's actual copying or trademark confusion. More on that later. But for now, let's quickly go over patents. It's true that sometimes more complex video game mechanics can be patented, such as the Z-targeting system from Zelda and even the encounter system from the first Pokemon game. But there's really nothing of relevance for this video, because most of the patents from the owners of Pokemon are either for hardware, server systems, or things that have long expired anyways, because most patents only last 20 years. And simpler mechanics are like simple ideas. You can protect your expression of it, but you can't monopolize the idea. But these limitations have worked to Pokemon's advantage over the years as well. One of the most popular Pokemon spin-offs is the Mystery Dungeon series. But before Spike Chunsoft worked with Pokemon on these games, they made similar spin-off games for Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, which in turn drew inspiration from Rogue all the way back in 1980. Moving back to the main series, most of these interview translations are thanks to Dr. Lava. The idea of trading came from creator Satoshi Tajiri's frustration with trying to get the rare magic hat drop from the Madcap in Dragon Quest II. And then the idea of making the game an RPG came later from seeing Final Fantasy Legend. And then for the creature designs, the original 151 and many more afterwards are all attributed to Ken Sugimori. And this is the part where some of you are expecting me to pull out that Dragon Quest meme. And as much sense as that would make, given the cultural impact of Dragon Quest, the number of games that borrowed ideas from Dragon Quest in that era, the fact that Tajiri played Dragon Quest II, and the fact that Dragon Quest V had monster taming mechanics 4 years before Pokemon's release, I can't find a single interview or source that says that Pokemon's creatures were inspired by Dragon Quest. And text on a wiki without a citation is not a valid source. Over the years though, multiple interviews have cited bug collecting, real-life species of animals, kaijus, mythology, folklore, pop culture, and more. Many of these are pretty obvious, and fun fact, the German name for Volcarona is Ramoth, an anagram for Mothra. And it makes perfect sense to either draw from the public domain, non-copyrightable sources, or by taking the non-protected elements of an existing idea. But of course that causes coincidences and overlap all the time, such as Balto and Claydol being based on the same real-world clay dolls that Dragon Quest, Shin Megami Tensei, and others were. So while that Dragon Quest meme can't actually be verified, it makes sense as to why it's floating around. Drawing parallels to what you're familiar with is completely natural. But let's go back to the legal standard of substantially similar. Oftentimes it is difficult to prove direct copying, which then brings us to the concept of establishing striking similarity instead. So striking as to preclude the possibility that the plaintiff and defendant independently arrived at the same result. Meaning that you have to rule out every possibility of it being a coincidence, result of independent creation, or coming from a prior common source. So in case some of us are thinking that you can't have this many coincidences on accident between Dragon Quest and Pokemon, let's compare a few and see if we can find a prior common source. Caterpie and Killer Pillar are both based on the same real-life species of caterpillar. Omanite and Sea Slime will even upgrade it to the Snail Slime, doesn't matter because Omanite is based on an Ammonite. Scissor Beetle and Pinsir, based on real bugs. Draki and Zubat are based on bats. Golem and Golem are based on a golem, you get the point. And now let's move ahead and compare some Pokemon designs to Digimon. Because while these two franchises don't debate as much now, back in the day these two shows first aired within a year of each other in the United States. And because Digimon came later, many of the ripoff accusations back then were eerily similar to the exact same Palworld ones we're hearing today. They're clearly ripping off Pokemon here. Slowbro and Shellmon are both fusions of two different Mons and have the exact same shell. Ho-Oh and Ho-Oh-Mon? You can't have this many coincidences on accident. Digimon's gonna get sued. Biggest difference between then and now, of course, being the prevalence of household internet and social media. And yes, sometimes Digimon comes up with the design first, but back in the day, I'm sure at least one person watching this has a childhood story of their parents who didn't know the difference between Pokemon and Digimon, buying them the wrong merchandise. So then how many copyright or trademark related lawsuits were there between Pokemon and Bandai Namco over the years as they actively competed for market share? 0. And it's not just because one was based on capsule monsters and one was based on Tamagotchi. The only even remotely relevant trademark case in regards to monster collecting as a whole was when Morrison Entertainment Group tried to sue Nintendo of America, alleging that their Monster in My Pocket line of toys was too similar to Pocket Monsters. But it was ultimately deemed to not be infringement. We're not going to play the hypothetical infringement game with Digimon here. 1, because most of these are easily explainable with a search for a common source, and 2 is because the reality between Pokemon, Digimon, and everything else that came around during that time frame is that designing these creatures and games from start to finish can take years. And because they're not obviously sharing information with each other, there's not always a reason to suspect foul play. Genuine coincidences do happen all the time. So now let's finally compare a few Pokemon and Palworld designs. Not a trick this time. But remember that these standards are incredibly high. You either have to prove direct copying or indirectly rule out any other possibility. You can't copyright an idea, but only your specific stylized expression of it. The courts don't want to rule in a way to create a monopoly. Public domain and non-copyrightable references have even less protections. It is accepted that there are limits to how many ways you can express an idea. It's less eligible for protection if it's been done before. And since I haven't stated it yet, you cannot copyright an art style, And there are many reasons why the argument of you can kind of sort of almost line up the two models and then they kind of sort of almost fit doesn't necessarily work in a courtroom. And take this last bit with a grain of salt, but looking at some of these other Japanese cases, the floor for creativity might actually be higher in Japan than it is the USA. So first up, we have Grintail and the Galarian Meowth Berserker. Standard Cheshire Cat trope design, and the oldest recorded reference to the Cheshire Cat is 1788, so it even predates Alice in Wonderland. Tansy and Grookey or Pansage, incredibly common concept, Digimon did it first. Icthyrdeer and Xerneas, I can't roll my R's, so forgive me Norway, but both of these are Norse mythology. Icthyrdeer is a reference to Icthyrnir, while Xerneas more so resembles the four stags and Yggdrasil. Leaf Monk and Leafeon, they're both carbuncle creatures, based on Chilean mythology and used in so many games like Final Fantasy that it has an entire TV tropes entry. And this also applies to most of the evolutions, so I can pretty much just copy and paste this exact slide for Eevee and Cremis. Not to mention they would showcase every other alternative angle and piece of artwork to show that it's not a carbon copy. Also, if you're going to look up carbuncle, please be very specific, or else you're going to find images of a skin condition with the same name. You have been warned. Next up, Lycanroc and Direhowl. Direwolves have been done by Dungeons & Dragons, Digimon, Monster Rancher, and a whole bunch of others first. Xatu and Toko Toko, Totems and Quetzalbirds. In a game that isn't as popular as Palworld, I feel like this design wouldn't even be criticized based on how many elements of it are so different. Jet Dragon and the Lottie Twins. Jet-themed dragons are pretty common, so you'd have to prove direct copying. Gobalion and Fengalope. Looking at the water and cloud aesthetics, Fengalope is likely a reference to Fuju from Chinese mythology, while inversely, Gobalion just looks like various stags fused together. And again, every last dimension and angle matters. Zebstrika and Univolt, not the same species, and the Thunder Unicorn as a whole isn't that unique or protectable. Meanwhile, Lamball and Wooloo are good examples of the merger doctrine. An unsheared sheep that also resembles a ball of wool is going to have a limited number of ways of expressing that. And there are definitely distinctions between the two. Anyone is allowed to make their own sheep ball-looking creature, you just can't specifically create Lamball or Wooloo. Same logic goes to Pangolin and Piplup. There are enough different elements between the two, and you're allowed to make your own cute penguin, you just can't make those specific copyrighted penguins. Plus, they're different species of penguins anyways. And then funny memes aside, Anubis is a reference to Anubis, Bushi is a reference to Bushi, Gyarados and Yormintide aren't even the same mythology, and Dragon Quest did it first, and you get the point. I'm not doing the full PAL deck here, and I won't deny that to me personally, some of them do look like distant cousins of other Pokemon. But I'm just showing how and why the actual standards are so incredibly high that most claims would never make it anywhere. And how if everything was held to Palworld standards where people are complaining about the themes, colors, and the smallest of details, most things you love in gaming and many of the Pokemon you love wouldn't exist because it would have been monopolized by whoever did it first. And while the cutoff line for inspiration is sometimes hard to determine and even harder to be consistent about, the general community standards in the gaming industry specifically are that it's not only okay to look at something and then decide you want to make your own version of it, but it's pretty much expected. And the voices that matter the most at the end of the day are the original creators and developers that are affected, but how often are they the ones who are actually getting outraged? They drew inspiration from something too, and whether coincidental or intentional, pretty much nothing in gaming is truly as 100% unique or original as we think, and that's not always a bad thing. And then when the debated designs, most of which aren't fully protected expressions anyways, only represent a small fraction of the game compared with just how many even more similar games are playable on the Nintendo Switch, Pokemon and Nintendo realistically don't care about Palworld nearly as much as the internet wants to believe. They're not actually foaming at the mouth over Palworld's success. Because whenever it looks like a competitor is actually about to arrive, Pokemon wins by doing nothing because all the people that enjoy the competitors tend to enjoy Pokemon too, and they're still going to buy the next Pokemon game when it comes out. All these overly sensationalized headlines about Palworld being investigated, from my own personal experience as a soulless office employee, this is pretty much the textbook business professional way that I would tell someone to leave me alone because I know how to do my damn job. So the only way you're going to see a lawsuit against Palworld is if they have an actual smoking gun of something being copied. And then in regards to potential trademark confusion, if you want an actual example of that, we had one just a few weeks after the launch of Palworld, with Pokezoo. Because Nintendo of America blocked Pokezoo's trademark filing. Promotional material for this game not only features the trademark stylized font of Pokemon and objects resembling a Pokeball and Gengar, but Pokezoo even went out of their way to appear in search results for Pokemon. Side note, I think it's kind of funny how the Z in Pokezoo is just a sideways N. But anyways, this is what actual trademark confusion looks like. And then this is the part where some of us may think that if Pokemon had anything on Palworld, they would have done something years ago when the first trailer dropped, but admittedly, there are several reasons why it's more complicated than that. In the United States, during the discovery process, both parties will either request or submit evidence. But the discovery process doesn't actually exist in Japanese law. So since you have to bring your own evidence, it can take longer since you want to have an airtight case. Additionally, while the Pokezoo story is from 2024, the first piece of promotional material for it is from 2021. So in the vast world of blatant imposter games and bootleg merchandise, things do slip through the cracks all the time. And the last complication is that for every takedown you hear about, such as the Pokemon Uranium and Pokemon Brick Bronze fan projects, there are thousands of other projects that would have been found infringement, even under fair use, that go unacknowledged for years or even decades. And it's not because they haven't heard of them. We don't truly know what Pokemon tacitly permits, because the moment they publicly acknowledge something and explain why they're okay with it, everyone else knows exactly what lines they can start tap dancing around. But back to the PAL designs for a moment, because some people are speculating that rather than one design, it might be several designs mashed together using AI, because the developers have overall positive views on AI and have produced a game called AI Art Imposter. And while I understand the controversies, concerns, and confusion behind AI, no AI usage in Palworld has been proven, nobody seems to be able to cite which AI 3D model generator could produce these PALs over the several-year development cycle in the first place, and there's an actual growing issue with being falsely accused of using AI. But if AI usage was found and wasn't actually disclosed, it wouldn't be Pokemon they have to worry about, because Valve would be the one to destroy them. Because as consumer-friendly as they are, the moment you touch their profits or increase their legal liability is the moment you find out just how strong their legal team actually is. So if any developer tries to pull a fast one on Valve by lying, and it leads to them having increased legal risk, or they have to deal with refund requests from angry consumers who weren't notified about the AI usage in the game, that developer will inevitably face the wrath of Valve. But again, nothing has actually been proven with Palworld using AI. But the other question is, how does AI and copyright work in Japan? At the time of Palworld's development, pretty much anything was allowed to be used for information training purposes, as long as your final product itself was an infringement. So you could theoretically make a cartoon mouse based on trained data, as long as it didn't look like Mickey Mouse or another copyrighted character. And while in the US there are a lot of uncertainties, looking at some of the recent developments and ongoing lawsuits, we might be going down a similar path. But for both countries, this information will probably be completely different if you're watching in the distant future. So to wrap this all up, the standards for actually proving copyright infringement are incredibly high, and there are limits to what expressions are protectable in the first place. You can't copyright an idea, but only your specific stylized expression of that idea, because it's supposed to protect your work and not monopolize anything and everything even remotely similar. In regards to Pokemon, I've been a fan since the very beginning, but unfortunately people calling anything even remotely similar a ripoff by hyper-focusing on the similarities and ignoring everything else really is just a tale as old as Pokemon itself. But the people who actually play both games tend to see the differences and enjoy them for what they are. Plus, history tells us that we'll always look back at some of the claims we made and laugh at how much of a reach they were, because the longer you look at them, the less similarities you see. But there's something about cute little monsters that just turn us all into giant rabid monsters sometimes. And that's all I got for you. Whether or not you like or dislike Pokemon, Palworld, or anything else in the genre, I hope you all learned something new and interesting. Hope you have a wonderful day, and with that, I'm off to go play the greatest monster taming series of all time.
Thank you, Shin Megami Tensei.